Andrew just mentioned you're basically the godfather of podcasting with your long interview form thing you did way back then, no?
Well, it's in a strange way that's true, although it was all unawares.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking I was participating in a revolution at the time. I was just thinking, my wife and I were driving and we were listening to an old series about Karl Polanyi, his daughter Kari telling stories about Vienna in the 30s. And we both looked at each other and we thought, why? This should be available to people. Like there's no reason why it shouldn't be. So I just, without really getting permission, which I probably wouldn't have gotten, we just began posting them. So yeah, and
you mean you just began posting your podcasts? You mean the ones you did on ideas?
Yeah. And pretty soon I realized that I all unawares was in the midst of a revolution.
Yes.
I mean, it's such a lost art form because like in the 70s, they were all like Dick Cavett, the NBC journalist who did like this long form interviews. And it's really an art form, to engage in in a good conversation for an hour or two and go into the ideas and build a rapport and stuff like that. It's really something.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
And I think what was different about David's podcast, David's radio show on ideas, I guess we're going here. We haven't done a proper introduction, but, we're with David Cayley, who just wrote a fantastic new book about Ivan Illich called An Intellectual Journey. And I'm related to you, and I've been listening to your podcast since I was your radio show since I was 16, and all of those shows, where you did Rene Girard and George Grant and Charles Taylor and so many people, big show on science have been part of my education. And so many other people, I think, that was already, I think, way ahead of its time because now everybody's doing what you were sort of doing in a very solitary way. It wasn't quite Dick Cavett because it was ideas, rather than celebrities. It was hardcore intellectual stuff on the radio. So do you feel that's true what I'm saying, or am I flattering you too much, David?
Well, how can I object?
Yeah. So anyway, so one of the most interesting shows you did do was the one on Ivan Illich, and because of his ideas and because of his voice, it's just this powerful voice. Voice in terms of ideas and voice in terms of how he spoke and how he transmitted those ideas and how he really exemplified his ideas as well. And so I guess we're here to talk about that, to talk about your book. I'll just put your book up here so everyone can see it. Ivan Illich.
I don't want to scare people, Andrew.
Journey.
It's not as long as it looks.
And also you're the author of many other books, but probably most known, I think, for your radio shows on ideas. And this book is really extensive, and it's not only a book about Ivan Illich, it's a book which I think it also expands a lot on it's your own intellectual journey as well, expands a lot on the ideas of Ivan Illich. So maybe I can start by just asking you about this statement by Agamben that we've reached, Ivan Illich has reached the hour of legibility. Like, his ideas are very important right now, and they seem to be more and more important. I've noticed this about other thinkers like Rene Girard and people like that that seem to be very important at this time in history, and why that is.
Well, I would say that it's true what Agamben says. I think Illich is reaching the hour of his legibility, and I feel I've had proofs of it in the last year in many conversations with people who seem to understand what I was talking about in expounding Illich. On the other hand, what Ivan thought would be or ought to be the hour of his legibility was the early 1970s, when he issued all these warnings and said that if there was not a limit found to the expansion of contemporary institutions, schooling, he proposed deschooling, medicine, he wrote about medical nemesis, tools for conviviality. He said if there were not a limit set to the development and elaboration of tools, we would occupy a kind of technocratic hell rather than what he proposed, a convivial society. So all those warnings suggested that a limit was being reached and exceeded in his time. So unhappily, the hour of his legibility is reached when it is becoming patent to all that that was indeed the case, that that we really are now living in medical nemesis in a certain way, and in a way that nobody thought was the case in 1975 when he claimed that it was. So yes. Yes is the short answer.
We're living in medical nemesis. Maybe you could expand on that for our listeners.
Well, Ivan,
we're getting right into the thick of it, I think, by bringing that
Illich,
up.
I always called him Ivan, so I'll call him that. Drew a lot on Greek mythology in his writings of the 1970s, even though he was Christian, and he was sometimes upbraided by fellow Christians for drawing so much on classical Greek imagery, but he very much drew on the figures of hubris, Tantalus, Nemesis, and so on, Gaia also, Pandora in his writings of that era. So Nemesis is the punishment for overreach, right? Prometheus was another figure that recurred in his work. And so he claimed that beyond a certain threshold, which he said was not a fixed threshold, but within any given set of parameters could be identified as a definite threshold, there would be too much medicine, for example. Too much medicine would occur. He spoke of iatrogenesis, a physician-caused harm, and said that iatrogenesis was clinical when the hospital system became so complex that people were getting the wrong drug or the wrong surgery or not being cared for or whatever was the case. But much worse, in his view, were social and cultural iatrogenesis. And if we just take the last, cultural iatrogenesis, he claimed that the ability to die at one's own death, to suffer with dignity, to live without diagnosis would wither. And, and that was there was a definite threshold beyond which that would begin to be the case. And I think that threshold has long been transgressed, and that we are living in a condition where it's impossible to live without constant diagnosis, where suffering is an obscenity, which doesn't mean it's ended. It just means it's lost its standing, its dignity, and its use. And that death is, as Illich predicted, the termination of treatment, and nothing in itself. So that would be his definition of medical nemesis.
Yeah. So we've already gone beyond the point, to a certain extent, and it's become very, very extreme. But I'm wondering if at this apocalyptic kind of moment, that the apocalyptic moment is the moment where people start to rediscover the art of living in some kind of way, even in their own small ways, or is that too optimistic, or is that
no? I think that's entirely true and entirely consonant with his thinking and his work. But he was, as I try to develop in the book, I can only say that he was an apocalyptic thinker by then immediately saying that he was a non-apocalyptic thinker. And I try to develop both those senses, because he definitely believed in apocalypse as revelation, which is the meaning of the Greek word, i.e., that something is progressively revealed, and unhappily, it's very often revealed by going too far. But he was non-apocalyptic in the sense that he was a believer in the beauty of here and now, always. What we can feel and experience and celebrate together now was always what was central for him. So he's not an apocalyptic thinker in the anticipation of some horrendous violence or some divine retribution or all the different things that people imagine. I mean, the word apocalypse in popular talk, what does it mean, right? It means some kind of living hell on earth. He didn't use the term in that sense. He used it purely as revelation. And maybe we can talk more about that later, what he meant by that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things he mentioned, I think it's just in the beginning of Deschooling Society, is the word escalation. That escalation of the methods of the teaching leads to some promised land. You know, that's like a ever more of, you know, appliances for school or in medicine, you know, will help us. But what it leads us to is, you know, we are, like as another author said, we're civilized to death. You know, we lost the true ways, and you have like the, you know, we adapted to some original prehistoric life, and then we created culture and we created this escalation in some sense, and we always have to balance these two visions of our human nature in a kind of way. No?
Well, I think when I spoke before about his recurring often to Greek mythology, there you have the thought of balance, right? You have the thought always of going too far, that there can be too much. There is a point at which things turn into their opposites, that the point of balance is exceeded. He found the thought well expressed there, so he drew on it. Christianity, in its corruption, although he didn't speak of this explicitly till quite late in his life, is the thought of an unlimited good, right? It's the thought of now. It's the thought of salvation in a certain way. It's the thought of a church that can fully institutionalize the gospel. It's the thought of an unlimited good which just continues, right? So you can't have too much of anything. You can't have too much schooling. You can't have too much medicine. You can't have, right? You can't have what my grandmother called too much of a good thing. And he, I think, believed that the genetic, if you want, sort of in the cultural sense of genetic basis of that is in a certain way of taking Christianity. It's not inherent in the incarnation, but it's inherent in an interpretation of the incarnation.
So Christianity gives birth to this one time this possibility, I think, and on the other side, this very dark utopia or something like that. And he was kind of exploring, he was kind of expressing both of those things. Was that?
I would say that's true. Yes, that his adage that the corruption of the best is the worst, which he shared with me at the end of a long interview in 1988, and astonished me. I had never, I mean, it's an old proverb, but I mean, the idea that you could understand Western civilization and its many sequels under that heading was entirely new to me. But that was what he thought, that Christianity was built around an unusually volatile idea, an absolutely explosive idea, which is that God could be man, and that we, in that light, could be free. And that once that idea is institutionalized, it's made once it empowers and licenses an institution that will progressively implement it. And he said that he felt modernity could be studied as an extension of church history. So he implicitly says that the baton passes from the church to a whole variety of modern institutions. That the result of that finally is the worst. It's the destruction of the original possibility of unlimited personal charity. There's increasingly nothing one can do that hasn't been foreseen, foreordained, planned, programmed, if you like. Right?
It's interesting. Me and Tom just got back from Berlin, and we went to this kind of progressive festival of ideas and, utopian thoughts about technology and, what to do about the present crisis. And it occurred to me while I was sitting there that this is church. That there was what was going on was just like church, except there was without the architecture. There was a congregation, and they were repeating ideas about the apocalypse and trying to comfort each other, and looking at each other and meditating together. And I was thinking about Ivan Illich in the later part of his career, or after he left the church, and how Christianity kind of moves through the culture without being in part of the institution. And I was wondering, didn't have an answer to this question, whether that was a good thing or or not. Are you following my?
Well, whether it's a good thing is quite a question. Rene Girard, who
it's
you
probably
mentioned,
wrong to say good or bad, but.
Well, I remember Rene Girard saying to me, and sometimes it's good when people say simple things to you, right? Mm-hmm. After the incarnation, he said, things will get better and worse at the same time.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is quite a thought, better and worse at the same time. How is that? Now, that's a very balanced statement. Ilich tends always to emphasize the shadow, right? Because he was a critical thinker. He didn't really ever create a positive program or feel that it was his place to create a positive program. So
but he allowed for that possibility.
The shadow,
right?
he always allowed for it. But he felt that was between people, to be invented spontaneously. That his task was to indicate what wasn't going to work. Right? What would be fatal? What should be proscribed? He said once to a friend that he was not a prescriptive, but rather a proscriptive thinker. But not because he was a scold, but because he respected spontaneity and free invention. But he realized that under certain conditions, spontaneity and free invention would become impossible. And those were the conditions he tried to indict.
Yeah, so he didn't elaborate the good news. He told us the good news was possible, but was sort of describing the hell that people had got themselves. So it was into whereas Rene Girard, it seems he has more of a good news in his.
Well, he does in a way.
But
you read them carefully. The more carefully you read them, the closer they get to one another. Girard and Illich, but superficially that would appear to be the difference. Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about your friendship with Illich, because this whole theme of conviviality and the preciousness of relationships and living in the moment, and that seems to be in the second half, when you read his early books, they're revolutionary. And I guess the second, when he got canceled, when he became not a cultural figure anymore after saying things that offended people, it seemed that what he was talking about more was this conviviality or friendship. So I think people might like to hear about your friendship with him and how that developed and over time and which you explore in the book too.
Oh yeah, the book is very much the story of a friendship and the continuation of the friendship. But I knew him first when he was one of the most famous men in the world. When he had his center in Cuernavaca, the Center for Intercultural Documentation, which was in around 1968, 69, 70, a kind of mecca for people, not so much for the Marxist left, but for those interested in alternatives, as one then said. And he responded to an invitation to come to Toronto for a teach-in on the pitfalls of international development, as it was then called. So that's when we first knew each other. But and he became my pole star in those years, and I read him very attentively. But we didn't meet again until 1987, when he had, I would say, after writing all those critiques that we briefly touched on, Deschooling Society, Tools for Conviviality, Energy Inequity, Medical Nemesis, all books seeking a constitution of limits, and very much conceiving it as a political constitution. He realized sometime in the early 1980s that he had been speaking at the end of an era, which was now over. That is, he was speaking of these institutions, however large, as if they were tools, and as if their users, however many there were, could stand apart from them and in effect change them. They were using them, and they could use them in a different fashion or cease to use them because there was that difference, that distance, which he felt had characterized the age of tools, or the age of instrumentality might be better. He always avoided the word technology because I think he thought it was a kind of a forbidding, intimidating ensemble. It just was, in the way in which Grant or Heidegger would speak of technology, it's just you're done before you start, right? So he always chose the term tools. But he realized that this age was, and I think realized it suddenly and was surprised that this age he felt was coming to an end, that there was really a new mentality in people. And he eventually characterized the new age as the age of systems, and characterized the difference between the two as really the collapse of that distance or difference between the person and the tool. The computer, in a way, all of us who have lived before this time bring some resistance into it. But generally, he said that in the age of systems, the difference between the system and the user is erased. The user is within the system. So that it wasn't really possible to consider reform in the way he had conceived it in the 1970s. So he became interested in this watershed and was working on the history of literacy, particularly, because the interface between the age of instrumentality, which is also the age of text, and the age of systems, which is, you might say, the age of distributed text, where text is everywhere, where your genetic code is a text and everything is a text. He was trying to study that by looking at earlier watersheds in the 12th century, in ancient Greece, and had just done a book called ABC, The Alphabetization of the Western Mind, and was called to Toronto to Emmanuel College for a conference. It was put on by McLuhan's successors,
I was going to ask you
at the University of Toronto.
If you don't mind me interrupting, just is there a crossover between McLuhan and Illich somewhere? In how
yes,
they thought about
met.
These things?
they met. A guy called Bob Logan brought them together. I don't know anything about the occasion in the early 70s. I know they had an evening together. I imagine they had a lot of fun together, but because they both were wild men in their way. But yes, but he also very much drew on this heritage that McLuhan drew on of Harold Innis, Eric Havelock, and those now sometimes called the Toronto School. And this book fits into that. So he was called to this conference in Toronto, and I went there to cover it for Ideas. And I asked him if he would consider, I did a short interview with him in order to create a program about this conference. And I asked him if he would consider receiving me and doing a longer interview, because I was very interested in expounding his ideas on ideas. And he said, no, it's out of the question. I haven't done that sort of thing for years. I have no interest in doing it. Forget it. All right. So the next day, we're standing outside Emmanuel College in the sunlight. The conference has just ended. And he glances over. By that time, my wife, Yuta, and our 3 young children have arrived. And he somehow takes us in, comes over and says, you know that idea what the suggestion you made yesterday, you may write to my colleague Wolfgang Sachs about it if you like. That's all. But something happened in that moment, and this was very characteristic of him, to turn on a dime. So I did write to Wolfgang Sachs, and I got an answer back from Ivan, which looked like it had been typed with his fingers on at least half of the wrong keys of the typewriter, but I could make out that he was inviting me to come down to State College, Pennsylvania, where he was teaching in the fall semester. And he said that he would do as I wished, that he would be obedient, he said. And I was not sure what that meant, really. That what that would be. It certainly didn't turn out to be that he would do whatever I told him to do, but it did mean a kind of willingness to belong to me that didn't end after that. So he allowed me to interrogate him in ways that brought his thought into a new perspective, even for his friends.
Sorry to interrupt again, but that seems to be such a different kind of relationship than the usual professional relationship or something like that. It seems that that's the only way he would operate, or it just, and that would be a creative relationship between you and him, which would go on for a long time rather than some kind of staged professional type of thing.
Yes, well, he often satirized the stage professional aspect of it. It made me initially quite insecure about it, but I got the hang of him eventually. But what is interesting is that those 8 days of interviews became eventually a radio series on Ideas of 5 hours, then a book. And eventually he came to visit me in Toronto, and I said, I would really like to follow up this idea you have of corruptio optimi pessima. I think you should write about this. And he said, well, yes, I will. And, next time I see you, I'll bring you some chapters. There never were any chapters. And so finally, he allowed me at the end of the 90s to spend several weeks interviewing him in Mexico for a second idea series, which then became, after his death in 2002, a book called The Rivers North of the Future. And that is the book where he lays out this conception of the church and modernity, which he had never really fully expounded in writing. And the point I want to make is that he might never have done so if I had not asked him. So that was the priority that he gave to personal relationship.
That's what he meant by obedience, I guess.
That's what he meant by obedience.
Uh-huh.
That he would be guided by me as I would be guided by him, and that we would trust that what happened was what ought to happen. Mm. So it was something I learned. It was a way I learned to be in relation to him. Right?
Mm-hmm. Great. So maybe we could talk about, there's one thing I wanted to talk to you about, and it's one of his more neglected books, I think, is this book, Gender. Because people are afraid to talk about that today or something. People are afraid to talk about men and women. And so in terms of his relevance today, and the relevance of that book and what he was saying in that book. Can you speak to that?
I can try, Andrew. I mean, there's something like 80 pages in that book that tells the story of gender, and I'm very eager that it be told and understood. But here's a short version as best I can. He, in the later 70s, well, okay, I got to go back a little bit farther. After he realized that he needed to go deeper into modern certainties than he'd gone in his books of the early 1970s, which, there's no lack of depth in those books, in my opinion, but that's the way he expressed it, was that what were the underlying certainties, or one could say myths, which gave these institutions their astonishing tenacity. Why were his proposals about disestablishing compulsory education or limiting medicine? Why were they had a kind of success de scandale, but nobody ever really seriously thought about it. How could you do it? So why? And he came to the conclusion that the myth of scarcity was the most fundamental underlying idea, that resources must be husbanded in specialized education called schools, because the means are by definition scarce. We can't do this ourselves. We need to deal with this scarcity. And he claimed something he never did in the later 70s, that he was going to write a history of scarcity. He did do a sketch for it in a brilliant book called Shadow Work. But one of the ideas he had, and he got this from two feminine and feminist historians, Barbara Duden and Claudia von Verhoef, who told him that what others understood as the coming of capitalism, they could describe as the demise of gender. And Illich was astonished by this idea.
And the source of that was feminist scholarship.
Yes, yeah,
which was what was it was the feminist that took him out at the.
It was feminists that he offended in the end in Berkeley in 1982. Yes. But it was also feminists who put him on that course and made him believe that in the women's scientific movement, I think he calls it in one of my books, might be the undoing of all the basic assumptions of Western modernity. So that the women, in his opinion, held the key, because gender anchors a system in which there can be no universal categories or universal circulation of anything, because there are fundamentally two always. So this was an inspiring idea to him. That there were in all pre-modern forms of thought, there is an underlying duality. I emphasize that this is not a dualism as people usually use the term, but let me just say duality, right?
Yeah.
Man, woman, but just as much here, there, me,
yin,
and
yin,
the
yang,
other one, yin, yang, right?
Yeah.
So when when this is a good little example. When Matteo Ricci goes, the Jesuit missionary, goes to the Chinese court, just as the missionaries in Japan were received at first, a great vogue, very interesting. And then they begin to see, well, but this doctrine of a master in heaven, letters to the court said, this will completely undermine the balance between heaven and earth, between the proper relation between yin and yang, heaven and earth, whatever it is. So this underlying duality, of which gender is one of the outcroppings, is what fundamentally distinguishes modernity from all pre-modern ways of life, without exception, he claimed. And that this duality was intellectually separable from patriarchy, which may predominate more or less in any given society, even to the point of there being a matriarchy, but there will always be this fundamental duality. And that modernity is characterized by single, universal categories, of which he chose sex. So he makes a pair of sex and gender as a contrast, right? It's a little bit confusing until you really read into what he's trying to say. He thought this all through with lightning speed in a year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and came to Berkeley in 1982 to deliver the Regents lectures, on fire with the idea of putting this out. The whole book is you know that image from Stephen Leacock, the distracted lover who rides madly off in all directions? His book is kind of madly off in all directions. It's a thrilling book, but it's
got big footnotes.
It's got big footnotes. It's a work in progress, right?
Yeah.
It's a report from the front. So he comes to Berkeley and is perceived by the feminist professors of Berkeley as a threatening and potentially reactionary figure, a kind of European maître à penser. They think he's stuck up. They think he's an elitist. They don't understand him. They think he's talking about the good old days. They don't hear him. They don't hear him in the way he wishes to be heard. They do, at the end of his lectures, a rebuttal. 7 Women. It's published as a special issue of a journal called Feminist Issues, widely distributed. And to this day, I think now it's not even an issue, but go back 20 years, and I'm meeting people who of course haven't read Gender. Why would they read Gender? It's a terrible book, right? Yeah. So
it's the Mein Kampf or something.
One of them called it compared it to Mein Kampf. I mean, it was pretty scurrilous, but it was effective, and it did interrupt, let's say, his relationship with the popular movements with whom he'd been moving together and to which he'd been trying to contribute ideas. He would not entirely. He was always a kind of godfather, I think, to the European Greens, and in various other ways, his thought continued. But basically, his interruption to popular movements, environmentalist, feminist, etc., was interrupted at that moment. Yeah.
And he stopped being one of the more famous people in the world, as you say.
Yeah, which was a blessing for him. It was a blessing for him in many ways. But one more thing is that the way he had used gender, and it was his claim that he put the word into circulation, and that might be true. He said when he went to the publisher, to Pantheon, they said, "Gender, Mr. Illich, this refers to the article you put in front of the noun. What is this?" Like, no one had heard the term, right? So perhaps he's right that he helped to put it in circulation. But within 3 years, it meant something utterly different, right? Yeah. It didn't at all mean the received categories that he was talking about, but it referred now to, it in fact became a synonym of sex and referred, in Judith Butler's thinking, to the performative aspects, the sort of cultural performance that goes with biological sex, or the imputation of biological sex, and so on. Everything changed. So his book is now lost in the mist.
Because we have such a
It
different
may come
idea of
back.
what gender is than what he meant.
Yes. Yes, it may come
for
back,
one
but right
thing,
now
for one
it's
thing.
lost in the mist.
Because gender means complementarity, and gender means the roles of the yin and yang, and whereas it doesn't mean something socially constructed or that's how I interpreted it.
Well, no, I mean I think he anyway. Yes, we probably want to talk about other things, but yes.
No, actually, I would like to know, what does he mean with gender and relationship to what is meant with gender today? Where's the difference? I didn't understand that yet.
Well, he claims that gender anchors or is the underpinning, one of the underpinnings of a way of thinking, right? In which let's say, if we take you and me, right? I can understand you only by an active imagination. So gender stands for him for what is hidden and what I can only discover by an active imagination.
What is other?
What is other? So otherness is fundamental to his conception of gender, and he then claims that this gender anchors an ascending hierarchy, which finally terminates in our otherness from God. But that part of the book was scarcely noticed and is buried in footnotes. But I don't know if, Tom, is that answering you?
Well, it reminds me in the form of, dialectic. Do you mean something like this? Or, where we relate to something and that culminates in the relationship to God? Is it something, or what do you mean?
Well, Gender was published in 1982. I had been living for 10 years living uneasily for 10 years with feminism. A year before Ilich published Gender, I read an interview with Robert Bly, who would later elaborate these ideas in a book called Iron John. Bly was an American poet. And Bly made the interesting observation that he was meeting a lot of deflated men, let's say. And the women seemed to have all the energy. The men didn't seem to know what or who they were anymore.
Right.
And Bly's understanding of that was that this was a kind of zero, there was a competition going on, right? It was a zero-sum game. But what one got, the other lost.
And the women were winning.
And the women were winning, definitely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so when I read Gender, it was such a gift to me, because I thought, this is a basis on which I can stop competing. This is a basis on which I can live and let live, be and let be.
That's another one of his big ideas, is complementarity, right? That's I think what you're talking about, rather than
that the inequality is essentially a result of competition within capitalist economy, but is not originally inherent in gender. Although it's quite possible to find traditional gender and patriarchy together. He never denied that. But that distinction was lost on his readers for the most part.
Yeah, what's so interesting about this? Because again, I'm not, that good informed on Illich as Andrew is, for example, or you are. But every time I encounter his ideas, it's as if I already, through some kind of osmosis, cultural osmosis, like got the gist of it, you know, because it seems that he was, for a lot of things, he was like an originator of certain ideas. And even if his books are not super popular today, these ideas, I understand them. It's like somehow I got them, you know, from culturalization, because you said maybe he was the one who brought this idea of gender and this word into motion and into, you know, introduced it in our culture. And same thing with deschooling society. These are ideas that I know and understand intuitively without, without even reading his books, you know.
Well,
that's so interesting.
I do think he was a very attuned man, right? Our mutual friend Nils Christie, who was a Norwegian criminologist, used to say that he felt Ivan was best understood as a visitor from the 12th century. And and I knew what he meant. I mean, that aspect is also part of him, that he really brought the past alive for people.
Right.
The reality of the past alive. And yet he was an unusually attuned modern person. Yeah. Very, very alert.
That's interesting.
To the stirrings within his culture. So what you say is quite interesting.
Now,
Yeah.
I mean, like Andrew and I, sorry to make this anecdote, but Andrew and I are always like talking about the Beatles, you know, and they had like this phase in the 70s where, and a lot of commentators, you know, talked about this, where it wasn't really clear if the culture was reacting to the Beatles or if the Beatles were reacting to the culture. And it was because it was so close, you know, that nobody knew where these movements were coming from. And so what you're describing from Ivan Illich, it seems a little bit like that, so that he had like his finger on the pulse of, you know, all these transformations that were going on in that time, and that you can't really, you know.
But also he was ahead of his time. So you say he was back in the 12th century, but here we're talking about how deschooling, for instance, is pretty relevant now as the schools kind of begin to crumble, and we're doing these podcasts and searching for you know, education outside of school everywhere, it seems like.
Well, Tom, just to finish that thought, after he wrote Medical Nemesis in 1975-76, and 10 years later, the Lancet, the British medical journal, I think, asked him to look back on it. He wrote an essay called 12 Years After Medical Nemesis, because he was slightly enumerate. And in that essay, he says, the great thing I missed in Medical Nemesis was the historicity of the body itself.
Right.
I took the body as standing outside history, but I don't think that anymore. And he became very much involved in a study that he calls body history. Like, how do we incarnate our time? How do we literally embody our time? And he felt we do so very, very precisely, right? And I mean, in the middle of this pandemic, right, where this is a great divide has opened up between those who say this is supposedly, you know, who question this in any way, right? Well, they're denying objective facts, right? And you get this polarization always. But in fact, I mean, what is it, right? How much of what we imagine becomes real?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Andrew,
How much of what is real is what we've imagined?
This is a good time for you to ask some questions.
No, because, you know, so, you know, when I look at the internet and the dialogue, the cultural dialogue, I see that, you know, in Germany and in France and in Europe, the conversation about the pandemic, you know, and the problems of the pandemic is somewhat different, you know, from what's going on in the United States. So, you know, we mentioned Agamben already. So you have like this ideas, you know, basically a philosophical problem, like how we deal with a pandemic, with an actual pandemic. I don't see that kind of a dialogue in the United States. What I see are questions about vaccinations and side effects.
Right.
And, it's like, I don't really care, about this form of conversation. But if I look at Ivan Illich and, the escalation of medical treatment, this is the core of the problem, which also like Agamben, addresses, the philosophical problem of the pandemic. Nobody is denying that there's a virus, and nobody is denying that vaccines help. I think we can skip that, but
Yes.
there's still philosophical problems with all of this.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think Illich has a key to understanding these problems. And would you elaborate maybe your views or Illich views, or what would he say about the situation?
I don't know what he'd say, but I found I had to speak for him at the beginning of the pandemic because it was actually Giorgio Agamben who promoted me to a kind of position in the world I had never been in before. When I wrote an essay called Questions About the Pandemic from the Point of View of Ivan Illich, and Giorgio put it on the website where he writes for Quod Libet, and it went all over the world. It was translated into every modern European language nearly, and I was astonished at what happened as a result of that. But what made me do it was I felt I had to call Ivan to witness, to explain. And because I was astonished, I mean, as I had been astonished before at the time of 9/11, and as I had recognized that others were astonished at the beginning of the First World War, how Europe could have, as Karl Polanyi said, sleepwalked into this catastrophe. 9/11 had the same feature that I remarked at the beginning of the pandemic. Everybody knew the day after the WHO put the word pandemic on the table, and lots of previous epidemics have been technically pandemics. There's nothing new here, but somehow the next day, the world went mad, or went sane. It depends how you look at it. But everybody knew what was going on, and within weeks, everybody knew that lockdowns would be necessary. Well, lockdown was a term that had been used in prisons and then sporadically in schools in North America, but had never been a tool of public health. Quarantine was for the sick. Quarantining the well was a completely novel idea, which everybody suddenly felt was common sense, right? When the British resisted, they were said to be following some sort of perverse herd immunity strategy. They were railroaded into line. Only the Swedes, God bless them, were able to resist. Nobody asked, might this be worse than the disease? And when Donald Trump finally said that, the fate of that idea was sealed. If Donald Trump thinks it, I'm not going to think it. But okay, so why this amazing unanimity? Why this new thought? How can this new thought collective suddenly appear? And my hypothesis,
how could you make a state into a hospital, basically?
Yeah, we'd been practicing. And that was where Ivan came in handy, right? So Ivan said, for example, with respect to risk, that he thought it was the most important religiously celebrated ideology of our time. So risk is, as an estimation of danger, is a common sense idea, right? But risk as the habitual recourse to some sort of mathematical construct in which you place yourself, right? So you know your risk of colon cancer, you know your risk of this and that. Perhaps you're being treated for a disease you haven't got yet. As a friend in Canada, a wit, said, you are pre-diseased. But
Pre-disease.
so it becomes a habit of thought that you should be anticipating everything, that you should be weighing the risk of everything. And I think that's a kind of long-term practicing of certain habits of thought, which then come into play. And I think safety is another. I mean, people have been adjuring each other to be safe now in Canada for 40 years, constantly. When I worked to give just a common garden example, when I worked at the CBC up till into the 1980s, our building was completely open. The society was not less dangerous then than now. But the idea that you would not restrict access to the CBC building, I mean, have security passes, gates, alarms, it's unthinkable. Why? It's the same. The reality hasn't changed, actually. You could actually probably show from crime that crime rates are lower. But
burglary's gone way down.
So again, it's security consciousness, a whole set of ideas that locks in, and before you know it, I think you have a new rationality. I mean, it's sort of like the old, and I know, apocryphal figure of the frog that's being cooked but doesn't realize it because the temperature only increases imperceptibly. But we had, we were basted in these ideas for 40 years, and then suddenly this new rationality is manifest. And
may I ask something else, because it's because you mentioned the security, and we had 9/11, or the Americans had 9/11, and the security went up. That was a seminal moment in national security, and and then you had like this other event, the COVID, and the medical treatment went up, and so, but this escalation Ivan Illich was talking about, that started way earlier. So do you think we are in a time where the escalation has escalated, and we are like in this exponential curve of where these events will happen more often, and we are like confronted with ever more events that change the nature of our own reality in a kind of way?
I think so. Yes. I mean, I can't just say yes.
No, but
yes, I absolutely think that's the case. Now, the intensity of media is a huge issue here, and the threat posed by the internet is obviously a huge issue here. Everyone is in a state of panic, and there's a similar panic, I would say, about science. So.
How is it? Where's the panic about science? What do you mean? Like, because it is under attack, or what do you mean?
To me, and this was a hope I cherished for most of my adult life, that we were in a kind of second scientific revolution, whether you date it from Ludwig Fleck or Thomas Kuhn or whoever, that ideas in the history and philosophy of science had accumulated to the point where an entirely new image of science, let's say Bruno Latour as an exponent of this, was available, right? And could be expounded, and was, I thought, beginning to be accepted, right? That the science wars of the 1990s, so-called, when a bunch of people said, well, this is just relativism, right? Unless we have absolute certainty, unless science is the authorized and only voice of nature, our society will collapse. Well, I thought that was over, and this has been an amazing opportunity for a kind of reactionary movement, right? So that following science, as our politicians say they are, has a kind of bright halo around it. It's between the people who follow science and the know-nothings, the ones who reject science, anti-vaccination, right? You create this whole enemy category. You lump everybody into it who isn't following science, and you've absolutely restored your monolithic conception of science. So this whole, as I said, second scientific revolution, whose fruit was to pluralize the conception of science, to stop talking about science and start talking about sciences, and recognizing that they know this and they don't know that, and to in a way force them into politics, as Latour says, in order to once again begin to have politics. Because as long as science is Trump in a certain way, you don't have politics, right? You just science says. The Premier of Ontario says, I got to do what the docs tell me. There's no he has no choice. He's not making any moral decisions. He's just following science. So I think it's been a huge opportunity for a kind of comfortable and anxiety allaying reaction.
Well,
that's a long way.
I talked to this guy named John Vervaeke who does 4G or 4E cognitive science, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's trying to, expand the idea even of rationality and of all this to be, but now we see, and I told you about our event in Berlin, and it was another observation I had was that science and religion are coming together, that people are talking about science with this new form of religiosity or something, which
I think that's true.
Is what you're saying.
I think that's true.
You can't almost have religion without using scientific terms to back up your spiritual platitudes.
But a question I'd like to raise, and this responds also to what Tom was saying a minute ago, is that one of the things that's happened in our media in Canada, and maybe true where you are too, is that scientific dissensus, let's say, dissent, the fact that from the beginning there have been epidemiologists, virologists, infectious disease specialists of all kinds who have dissented from
They're
the
heretics,
policy and been kept out of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And dissent has been, in a way, localized in this enemy class, right? These are QAnon supporters or Trumpians or Brexiteers or anti-vaxxers, right? So any critical conspiracy theorist, that's another one, right? And so this polarization, which is, I think, quite reckless and quite dangerous, hides how many are there who are not in either camp, who have never wanted to be in either camp, right? Who are fully supportive of sciences, right? Only they don't have the same conception of them, but they don't think of them as a monolithic oracle. How many are we? Is there a possibility coming out of this for a political realignment? I think it's an interesting question. Just as, the explosion of discourse on the internet, which, as we are currently engaging in, is still on. We can't get behind it. We're in the middle of it, right? We don't know.
And it doesn't belong to official institutional voices.
It doesn't
either.
belong.
So it's everywhere, but it doesn't have a home or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. And it is probably maybe it's a larger amount of people than the two polarized camps, or at least it's a lot of people, or I don't know.
And the paradox I've observed is that as more people think for themselves, the panic about misinformation grows, right? And the attempt to restore order becomes more attractive. We got to go back to authoritative opinion, right? Yeah. And this is a little bit like in 1975, after all the popular movements that grew up, the anti-Vietnam War movement, but many others, right? There was a panic, which produced a book by Samuel Huntington called On the Governability of Democracies. Noam Chomsky gave it a lot of importance in his writings of the later 70s. But this really was a crisis because people were thinking for themselves, right? And you can't, how do you govern a society in which people think for themselves?
Well, you can't, I
And
guess, in a top-down way, or...
My hopeful hypothesis is people are thinking for themselves.
Yeah.
And where that may go is unclear at this point.
You're raising a point there, and another friend of ours mentioned, it's like the question, how do you govern people, like a growing amount of people? And that was the question of, the founding fathers, and one answer that they have, and which is embedded in a kind of in the democracy, is you instill a mechanism by which they govern themselves. And so you have like this Christian Protestant ideal, by which they apply to the obligations of the state, and that is a common theme running through our democracy, I think.
Yes, it's very explicit in John Adams, for example, who says the United States would in no way be governable if its people were not a Christian and moral people, right?
Right.
The checks and balances we are installing will work only on the assumption that these are a moral and religious people. So what's going on now is in a way a religious crisis.
Do you think?
Could be because people don't believe they can govern themselves. They've traded too much of their agencies it's proven science was what my colleague told me. I was like, oh yeah, that was proven science 5 minutes ago, but that's what we believe in right now. And
well, let me try and vindicate my claim that this is a religious crisis.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is most interesting about Illich, and one of the reasons I have hopes that this book will start conversations, is that Ivan claims that we're living, in effect, claims that we're living in a Christian society, right? That modernity is a transposition, a perversion, he says, of the Catholic Church. Now, Muslims will say that they're Muslims often, regardless of their belief, as will Jews. But Christians won't. Christians who cease to be members of a church generally cease to be Christians or to describe themselves as Christians. So we miss the character of our society as a Christian society. If Illich is right, then we will not be able to think the religious question or think the social question until we recognize what it is that we're dealing with, how we got into this condition. So I think is a very promising thought. It's a hopeful thought. But it is very difficult to start that conversation often.
I'm not sure I get that.
So he viewed modernity as an offspring, or like as a perversion of Christianity, or what are you saying?
Yes, exactly. As an extension of church history.
Right. And that the term modernity only applies to the Christian world and the Christian worldview, and doesn't really apply to Arabic or whatever.
Well, I think it applies to all who embrace it. He didn't claim it was genetically Christian, but it wasn't. It spread everywhere. It was attractive to all. But let me take a concrete example, which is developed in the book, The Rivers North of the Future, and again in my book. Ivan claims that sin, as originally understood by the Christian community of the first millennium, was a glorious idea. It was the idea of the possibility of being forgiven. So it was a light in which I could view the possibilities of my friendship with you. And it was a basis for mutual forgiveness. It was also an understanding of our flawed nature. In the 12th century, something took place that Illich calls the criminalization of sin. So the church, according to canon law codes and church procedures, sin becomes a certain kind of crime, right? Which can be forgiven by a priest and absolved by a priest. But it completely alters and obscures the actual nature of the idea of sin. So today, the word sin refers to, I mean, nobody wants to hear about it. It's a feeling of guilt,
Punishment,
of uncleanness, of something that I need to get over in order to be a healthy contemporary person. It's an idea that has no content, but I think it needs to be understood. I don't think we can think about ourselves without that idea. But a process of looking for the future in the past has to take place, and I'm sure that's not going to be a popular proposal. And yet, to me, it seemed to me that's finally what Illich was saying.
You mean the past notion of sin?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
got it. Mm-hmm. What about charity too? Because that it seems like there's a similar notion in Illich about let's say the Samaritan who lifts the Jew out of the ditch, and there's a notion that he chooses to do that out of love or whatever. Whereas the modern institutionalization of charity just makes us captured by something and dehumanized, or
I think that's exactly what he says. I mean, that he treated the parable of the Samaritan as a paradigm of the New Testament as a whole, a kind of epitome of it. And he says that the story was, for many centuries, misunderstood in a kind of Kantian light as the story about how one ought to behave towards the neighbor, what one ought to do when someone is found in a ditch. Mm-hmm. But in fact, he wasn't asked what one ought to do. He was asked, who is my neighbor, by a certain lawyer, the text says. And so he's trying to say that my neighbor is whoever calls to me, whoever appeals to me, and that this is an unrecognized mode of causality in our world. It's not a form of causality at all necessarily, but so that he responds to this individual one in his plight. He does it at cost to himself, since he's a Samaritan and ought to leave this technically enemy alone, whatever his problem is. But he doesn't. He reaches out to him. But for Illich, it's never a teaching about an ought. It's a teaching about a call and the possibility, the possibility of a call. And it claims that the incarnation, so he says in The Rivers North of the Future that the incarnation is a surprise, remains a surprise, and cannot exist as anything else. It's an astonishing statement. So
it could never become a code or something.
No,
like that.
Nor can it be understood as a necessary event. It isn't caused, it's called into being. And what can come into being by people who operate according to an uncodified call is unclear at any given. You don't, especially in a world of codes, of ever more codes. Mm-hmm. You can demonstrate that something glorious can happen locally, immediately, here, now, between you and I.
Yeah.
But what kind of society could exist in that light? It's no more real than the kingdom of what Jesus calls the kingdom of heaven, right? It is the kingdom. It is the kingdom of heaven, mm-hmm. right? But it's achieved here and now, one step at a time, by a call, by attending in the present. And he claims, as you said, that the more you institutionalize charity, the more you inhibit acts of personal charity. They can never be entirely inhibited. This is all relative, right? Yeah. This is all on a continuum, but that you overshadow acts of personal charity are overshadowed. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, that's the interesting thing in the United States. I mean, I always say the United States are a constant source of, frustration and enthrallment in a kind of way, because they're, it's like both at the same,
Imagine living next door.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But, it's like, as far as a European understand what's going on there. And so you have like the right-wing people who kind of decline, healthcare and are opposed to it more or less. But on the other side, their charity seems genuine when they help each other out and they come together from the heart. It is like you don't find that kind of authentic charity in the East or West Coast people. It's somewhat different. These the spirit of. Yes. And I always find this interesting,
I think it's
that
true.
If you take this away, the institutionalized charity, then, the authentic act appears.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That was what he said.
And he also talked about the difference between the she of the church, like that, and the it, where in relationships become instrumentalized all the time, which takes away from what you're talking about, Tom.
Well, yeah, he was an Orthodox Christian, and so he believed in the divine ordinance by which the church was created. But he did, yes, always make this distinction that the church, as the breath of heaven, as the pearl in the net, as he said once, this divine bud that will flower in eternity and so on, is very different from the sociological reality, right? The church, insofar as it obeys earthly laws of power, influence, and tries to sustain itself in time. So yes, that distinction, I think, is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. I mean, to know the difference is everything in a certain way, right? But he didn't get far with this. He didn't get far in the church.
He didn't get far in the church, and he was subject to Inquisition almost, right?
It was Inquisition.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Right.
The Holy Office was the successor of the Inquisition. He was summoned by the Holy Office, made to answer leading questions, and finally just refused the whole procedure.
So I think we went on a tangent in regard of the pandemic and Ivan Illich. So did you fully explain what his view would be on the current situation?
Well, I'm sure I didn't, and I'm not sure at all sure that I can. But I since he has to use me as his ventriloquist dummy. But I did try to explain that I think that the new habits of thought that he foresaw are going on in it. What he would have said on specific scientific questions, I don't think I want to comment on that, right?
Right.
Whether he certainly was. He published in the 90s a manifesto that he called Hygienic Autonomy, and it's really quite radical. I mean, it's essentially that nobody can be made to take any medicine that they don't want to take, and nobody can be declared, people have the right to think for themselves, was
Right.
is the fundamental thought, and
Right.
to die undiagnosed, he says. So he greatly feared the power of diagnosis.
That's profound, yeah.
Which is a certain way, in Girardian terms, it's the mimetic power, right?
Yeah.
It's the power of the category once created to reshape people in its image. And his last public talk in Bologna in 1998 was called "And Lead Us Not into Diagnosis, but Deliver Us from Health." So he greatly feared the expansion of diagnostic categories and the dissolution of experience, let's say, by categorization, by expertise. The proliferation of diagnostic stereotypes and therapeutic stereotypes. So whatever the physician has in his arsenal, you will more or less have to conform to it. And similarly with the diagnostic categories.
And that wasn't only
and increasingly there are no physicians with whom one has a personal relationship.
Yes.
It scarcely, I'm sure it exists somewhere, but it scarcely exists. And so the physician is a functionary of the system, and much more so than when Illich wrote.
That gives me an insight as to why people are going to see, doing ayahuasca ceremonies in, Ecuador, and it's because that's lacking from the culture, and people need that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a friend of mine, I always mention this because a friend of mine, when the whole pandemic started, he was quite lucid, and he told me, he went to a routine checkup with his father. It's like it's a while back, a couple of years back, and he was quite fine. But the doctor diagnosed him with, I think, blood cancer or something like this, and then his decline began. So because he was quite fine, but it was the diagnosis who sent him spiraling downwards, and he used that as an example of what happened with the pandemic. That some physicians or scientists looked at the virus and diagnosed culture, with something that probably was, in some form around, for years already, but there was no diagnosis, and somebody did this diagnosis and sent the culture spiraling downward in this frenzy that we're in for 18 months now. And I found that a quite, interesting metaphor, or a description, what a diagnosis can do.
Well, yeah, I think the issue gets polarized. So if you want to draw attention to the constructed aspects of the pandemic, you will almost certainly be accused of denying that there's an underlying physical substrate of some kind, that there's a virus. No, I'm not denying that there's a virus, but that doesn't mean that people are not maddened by reading a newspaper which has nothing else in it for months on end.
Right.
that will make you think that this is so much more salient. How would you think if that didn't happen? How salient would this be? How many people were ill was always very hard to find out. How many people had tested positive? I mean, this is an astonishing scandal of the whole pandemic, right?
Right.
But the PCR test doesn't tell you who's sick. It's an astonishingly sensitive register of the presence of this virus in some trace amount, especially when you run it at these very high numbers of cycles. But it doesn't tell you if anyone is sick. So it was very hard to find out who was sick, right? What was being experienced was in a way drowned in numbers.
Right.
So a strange thing.
Strange phenomenon, yes.
Yeah.
And I guess also the thing that's very marked about Ivan Illich is how this was not merely theoretical for him. That he had cancer and he refused to have that diagnosed, and
Yes, he that's true. Although he wasn't at all a fundamentalist. He made in relation to the tumor that was on the side of his face, he made a very considered decision about it.
Yeah.
And
which would be scandalous to most people, but from his point of view, considered.
What was his point of view there?
Well, it was quite personal. I mean, I think one of the most important bits of advice came from a Pakistani physician in the Unani tradition, which is really how Galenic medicine eventually was translated into the Muslim world. And he very much liked and admired this man, Hakim Syed Muhammad. And he had lectured in Pakistan, and this doctor came up afterwards and said, he said, Mr. Illich, what you're telling us is that if we join this enterprise of pain killing, we'll be the most effective importers of the Christian culture. And Ivan was just delighted by this perceptive comment, and they became friends. So he consulted him when this little lump appeared on the side of his face, which could have been who knows what. Nobody ever knew whether it was a benign or a cancerous tumor. But the advice from his friend was that this was part of his person, that he should live with this. And I think he took that very seriously. And I think that if I look at it from the outside, he had said in Medical Nemesis that people were losing the capacity to give to suffer as a dignified performance, he said. And I think he was called to live that he suffered in an inspiring way in the last 20 years of his life, and it did inspire and moved people around him.
And he didn't use painkillers at all.
And I think for himself, he had been a great man, bestrode the narrow world like a colossus, as Shakespeare says of Julius Caesar. And that's certainly an invitation to pride.
He didn't use painkillers, or
he did. He smoked opium.
Oh, okay.
He liked the raw opium very much. They gave him bottled form. He didn't like it. He liked the old-fashioned way you would have smoke, where you put a candle under a silvered paper and the opium slides down. And you follow it with a straw.
Oh, wow. Mm.
You even like to get real straws. It was a ritual, and his friends often joined him in it, even though we didn't have any need of the analgesia. And but yeah, so he tried to get distance from the pain, but I think he was purified in that fire in some way, until his love and humility seemed to me perfect by the end of his life. And I don't know how much of that he thought, but I would like to distinguish it from any kind of fundamentalism where I'm against modern medicine.
Right. Yeah.
He had a hernia that was bothering him. He had it operated on. He had some dental issues. He had dental surgery.
That is so beautiful what you're saying.
This was a specific thing that he felt.
If I may,
called to bear.
And if I may, ending, closing in this podcast, because what you're saying is that he used that sickness, what he has, to purify his love and compassion and be perfect, and that is what I'm sensing, what you said, and what comes to me. And so what the institutions are doing, the media, the school, the medicine is enabling us to not do this, to become better, to become perfect in a kind of way. I mean, not perfect in the sense I have a perfect haircut or I have so much money. No, character-wise, I'm the ability to love unconditionally, that all the suffering, the dignity of suffering in a proper way helps us to become more than what we were. You know what I'm saying? And this is that what
I think it's beautiful. I think it's beautifully said, and I think it's exactly right. So it's very hard to convey this because institutions as supplementary would be most welcome and necessary, right? It's when they replace people, right? When they act for people, right? When you can't get an education because in a way the institution is getting the education on your behalf. You're just going along. It's the loss of spontaneity. It's the loss of responsiveness one to the other. It's the loss of initiative.
I mean, it's a Christian myth. We have
to the institutions. Yes,
we have to be our suffering in ordering to, find something higher, even maybe God within us. It is not possible without suffering and without, the right approach to suffering to do this, and to, media and education can't enlighten us in this sense.
No, exactly.
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's really profound and important. And geez, wow.
Maybe that's the end.
Maybe that's the end. Yeah. Yeah.